Fletcher of the Let's Talk History series, our 2025 season. But don't worry, Brad Fletcher is hard at work on next year's plans. So we'll be back together soon. January or February? February. So I'm going to do thank yous before I begin with the content because they're so important to us as an all-volunteer organization again. As we know, it really does take a village to do all that we do. So first of all, I'd like to thank the First Parish Federated Church for providing us with this wonderful space, and our tech guru, Alex Noble. I'd also like to thank Arlene Goodwin, our board member, for joining us to make this happen. Signs and moving things around and being here on time takes a lot. I'd like to say thank you to Sally Hunter, who is another board member who gets our volunteers for refreshments. Sally, who you recognize tonight for refreshments? Is it on? I want you to talk.
I'm not used to public speaking, but I want to thank Sid and his wife and a huge amount of volunteers who make cider every year. They donated the cider out there. It's an amazing time. And Jerry Wessel, who made really delicious sticky bars in the middle of the table. But in about 3 weeks or so, you'll see a sign in front of the church saying turkey supper. And every time they have supper, the people of this church join with one of the local NGOs, and that's us. So if you come, if you don't feel like cooking on November 15th, which is a Saturday, so if you don't feel like cooking, please stop by and get one of the turkey dinners. So not just one, get some turkey dinners too.
And if you want to come peel some potatoes, you can come do that too. Or parsnips. Are those parsnips? Is that what those? No. Okay. I did that one time. Okay. Also, I would like to thank Quebecois Savings Bank, who has been our sponsor for 25 years. So without them, we would not be doing our lecture series. So thank you to Quebecois Savings Bank. Next, announcements. I want to remind you this Sunday from 1 to 4 is our very last day for our French Presence, Land, Liberty, and Legacy exhibit. In it, you'll find things about the earliest French settlers and Native Americans, Lafayette, and Happy Valley. We're happy to report the Happy Valley portion will stay up for 1 more year. So it will be there, but it's really nice to see the whole exhibit as a whole. So come on down Sunday 1 to 4. Okay, we are having our annual auction at the end of November. You can bid on experiences like a tour around historic areas of town with Norma Keim. Perhaps a trip and a tour with our very own Brad Fletcher, but I haven't asked him yet. But if he got some positive feedback, he might say yes. And also, we have framed maps. And what else was I going to say? Oh, also, we have some of some items from Mark and Ginny Alterio's collection, and those will all be for sale. So please bid, and you can find yourself some good Christmas gifts. Also, last thing, our historical society depends on the energy, creativity, and commitment of our community. And right now, we need your help. Membership and volunteer participation have declined in recent years, but there's never been a more important time to get involved. Whether you can lend a hand for a single event, give us a little hand on our old building, serve on the board, or help with the many behind-the-scenes jobs that keep our programs running, your time and talents make all the difference. Join us as a member or a volunteer and help preserve, share, and celebrate the stories that make our town's history come alive. Reach out to any of us or through our website, oldberwick.org, for more information. So, with that said, please welcome Brad Fletcher. without the mic.
So thanks for coming tonight. This is an amazing turnout, so I think you're here because you know him. Which is to say, I don't think Peter Michaud really needs much in the way of an introduction from us here. Anyone who has been part of this organization for any length of time or been involved in history-related things around the seacoast has run into Peter Michaud. He began his career working in history with Historic New England. It was then probably SPNEA, right? Then he moved on to the New Hampshire Division of Historic Resources, where he has this amazingly long job title I won't go into, but he had a lot of stuff going on there for a long time. And now he is a cultural regional manager for the federal government out of the shipyard. Yeah. Which I will say, I did dig into this, he has nothing to do with the ballroom. He's clear on that one, right?
Are you sure?
Yeah, I'm very sure. Professionally and personally, Peter has committed himself to the culture and history of the seacoast for his entire adult life, and probably before that, but I didn't know him then. He sits on boards, he serves on committees, he consults, he's a member of groups, wherever you go around the seacoast. He writes, he lectures, and he's here tonight to share with us one of South Berwick's most interesting neighborhoods. So, Peter.
Thank you. So confession, when I first was asked by Brad to do this talk, I started doing research, and of course the first thing you do is turn to Google, and I typed in Hog Point, and one of the things that came up was Peter Michaud will be giving a talk in 2004, which I had named Making the Point, which shows that my mind is not that great. I walk in circles. But, you know, if you take that talk in 2004, which I have vague memories of it was rubbish, I apologize. This one's going to be much better, I promise. And I'm excited to sort of come back to this topic for a variety of different reasons. And one, we're talking about a neighborhood that has an infamous reputation. When friends of mine were looking for housing back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, they looked at an apartment at Louise Flanders' house. Louise Flanders' house is still standing on the corner of York and Main Street. I'm going to pick on poor Mrs. Flanders, but Miss Flanders, excuse me, not frankly, she deserves it. Sorry. When asked where else they were looking, and hearing they were looking at an apartment in the area of the neighborhood, we're talking about what we're calling the Point right now. Miss Flanders quick, oh no, you don't want to be associated with those people. It's also a story that falls within my research interests. I've been studying the history of the Salmon Falls Manufacturing Company pictured here for over 30 years, and that's really almost a depressing confession to make, but for 30 years, this has been part of my life research. And I've always felt that to fully understand the village on this side of the river, a better understanding of the main side is needed. They are interconnected in many different ways. It's also an area of very different names with overlapping usage, and in some cases, little understanding of their origins and meaning. We have Hog Point. It's also called Happy Valley. It's called The Point. Or most recently, where Fogarty's is located, or Lower Main Street. You could pick any of those names, and we're all talking about the same neighborhood. And it's a personal story. For generations, my family, those people lived up the Point and they called it home. Including my mother, who's sitting over there, and can be seen in the green sweater in the center of the photograph right here. She's not going to do it. And it's a neighborhood that has a school, newspaper, grocery store, bakeries, clothing store, billiard rooms, barbers, and illegal bars. It was at one time a skip away from 2 rail lines and a terminus for the local trolley line. It was called out in the papers as the toughest neighborhood in York County, and yet, when viewed from the edge of town, like this lower panoramic scheme here, it's indistinguishable from South Berwick Village, Salmon Falls, and Shoetown. For much of the 19th century, it was not even part of South Berwick. We'll talk a little bit about that. And it's an area that became home to both Yankee, Irish, and French Canadians. All of them are those people. So with this talk, we're going to take a look at the development of the Point from farmland to thriving commercial center that we see here to discuss how the community made the Point. So what's the point? And I'm not having an existential crisis. This is not my, it's not good when you're talking like 5 slides and you go, oh my God, what's the point? Let's all go home. But I wanted to just take a moment to place us all on the same page and, what neighborhood we're actually discussing. So, I work as an architectural historian, and we do what we call survey. And part of that is, you want to understand the boundaries of the neighborhood that you're going to survey. And that boundary needs to be something where you have an area of properties that have common themes of development and usage. So the point is a neighborhood that occupies the northwest corner of South Berwick. And for the people that lived in this neighborhood, they were probably not all that concerned with the boundaries that I'm setting. They moved in and out of the point, and frankly, the boundary between the state of Maine and the state of New Hampshire was really not a boundary as well. People during the 19th and even into the 20th century flip-flopped across that border as if it really didn't matter what side you're living in. You really weren't changing, you may be changing states, but you weren't changing the community in which you lived. But the boundaries, which we're going to talk about, are basically the B&M Railroad line to the north, which you can sort of see here. Beyond that is the town of Berwick in a more rural setting. Once you go to that railroad track, you are out of the point, and it is visually that way. To the east is Route 236, behind which is a gully that separates this area from Shoecap. So you've got a geographic change, as well as a whole different area of development that occurred with Cummings Mills on the other side of that gully. The Salmon Falls River forms a natural border to the west, and then the southern border is one that needs more evaluation. That's the orange dotted line at the bottom. And what we really need to start doing, and this is something that'll be another research project, we need to start teasing out what is the expansion of La Pointe and what is the expansion of the downtown or Southburg Village. And it's likely this is not a clear line. It's already muddled with the location of the former Catholic schools that serve the residents of La Pointe, located well within Southburg Village. And it's questionable if the line extends to Yonge Street, where our good friend Louise Flanders lived, and she would deny that it did. But that's where also the Catholic Church that these people would have gone to church at once stood. So the southern border is complicated and needs more research, but I've given it this line of convenience up Butler Street. It is likely that the area of the point, and this is a wonderful map from 1795 of the town of Berwick. It's a fantastic map. It's likely that the area of the point with its major waterfall in the Salmon Falls River and that side tributary of Salmon Falls Brook, Driscoll's Brook today, was an area attracted to the Native Americans who first lived on this land. Settled around 1631 and originally part of Kittery, Berwick was incorporated in 1713 with land that is shown in this map encompassing present-day Berwick, South Berwick, which was later incorporated as a separate town in 1814, and North Berwick, which became a separate town in 1831. On the left is the full map, with the area that is detailed to the right carved out in a box. And then in the detail, you can see another smaller red box, and that's where the area of the point is. So just trying to give you an idea of where we were or what this area had in the 18th century. The blue dot or blue star that you see on both maps marks the location of the First Parish Federated Church where we are today. Unfortunately, one of the things that I wanted to understand is like wayfinding. How did one get through the point until, the roads that we know there were developed later on in the 19th century? Unfortunately, the early maps only show those major thoroughfares. They don't show those other roads, which also shows, we talk about Salmon Falls and the sawmills and how important they were there. But they weren't important enough for people to show how you got from here to there on maps that were being drawn in the 18th century. Now this map is not a historic map, but it's one based on historic research. It is a map drawn in 1926 from research that was done by a local historian, Everett Stackpole, for his 1926 essay, The First Permanent Settlement in Maine. And it shows the early settlement of South Berwick, which was denser to the south, below where the Counting House is today. And in the detail to the left, you can see where the area of the point is, you can see where I am directionally challenged. You can see where that area of the point is carved out. And what I want to start showing this is, that this is not an area that had a lot of development. We are in open farmland, basically. You know, there's that, you can see what he calls Santa Falls Brook sort of wending its way through, that runs through the heart of the point today. And there's no major development there. There's not a lot of buildings. You know, there's farms to the north, there's a farm to the south, but there's really nothing there. This changes. You know, soon after the creation of South Berwick in 1814, the development of the textile mill in Santa Falls becomes the catalyst of change for this area in South Berwick. So in 1822, yeah, that would be fun. In 1822, James Arnold of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, incorporated the Santa Falls Manufacturing Company, both in Maine and New Hampshire, building several mill buildings on the Santa Falls side of the river for the production of woolen cloth. These two maps from the Old Berwick Historical Society collection, which are wonderful, wonderful resources, show Santa Falls around 1834. The more grayish maps are 1834, as well as the area in 1838. And I have the full map as well as details from each that you can see. And what we can see here is the 1838 map is fantastic because it shows the location of 18th century dams and mills that existed on the Santa Falls River. Oops, and there we go. Sorry, we're going back. And both mills show the crossing to South Berwick, which, you know, that is not where the bridge is today. That bridge was moved further north when they built mill number 2 in 1849. And after crossing the river to Maine, there is, you know, like right now, you straight shot right into Berwick, but there is no road there. You either had to turn left and go north or turn right and go south and sort of follow the river either up to meeting up where 236 is and heading up to Great Falls that way, or follow the river down basically near to Quebecois Falls where the company house is today. That is how you got to this area and to Santa Falls. Oh, that is not good. Let's try this again. The bad part about PowerPoint is things like this happen. The good part of PowerPoint is it is easy to recover. Slideshow and play from current slide. Let's hope this doesn't happen again. Now we know there was a road that followed the river more or less because the development of the mills resulted in the creation of what is now known as Butler Street, shown on this map from 1835, which was opened in May of 1822 to provide easier access from the village that had begun to form around where the Jewett House is today with the creation of the Boston to Portland Turnpike. And you know, this provided more direct access from that village center to the newly created mills at Santa Falls. And I just want you to note as well, because we'll talk about this later, on this 1835 map, the brook is called Santa Falls Brook. And we actually, you know, what I love is, you know, this road is hiding in plain sight. If you look at the road to Quebecois, can still be seen on the landscape when using the correct tools. Light detection, ranging, or LiDAR scans of this area show, and LiDAR is great, it shows nuances in the landscape that topo maps can't show. And this shows the area where the road was leveled or built up. So on the left I have, so you can see on one side there's a LiDAR scan. I'm just going to get up here real quickly. And you can see, maybe not so much, but if like here's Butler Street, you can see this cut here and this cut here. And that curve that you see that I marked out in blue matches the curve crossing over where Santa Falls Brook is to that appears on those maps that I showed you a couple slides earlier. So, you know, what we had was this road that, you know, would travel up to where it would travel over the river, curve up, travel up to meet where Butler Street is today, and then we see that cut in the embankment below toward the south, which appears to be the road heading further south to what is now Sewell Drive. And I just marked, we'll talk about it later, but the yellow line is a rail line, the bed of which still exists today in places. The northern portion of the road even survives on the tax map, this portion of the road even survives on the tax maps of the town. The property lines to the north and immediate south of Butler Street still follow that old road. And I've marked that out in red, which is also kind of incredible that you know, early road still is marked out because of the way properties currently added. Now, the second major influence on the development of the point was the arrival of the Boston and Maine Railroad. With its station at Santa Falls Village, pictured here around 1865, this direct connection to Boston and soon after Portland connected the area to the larger borough. The bridge the company built, both photos, also circa 1865, changed the landscape for both Santa Falls and the point, And the tracks laid in Maine became the northern boundary of the point and later the town. And so when you think, like, all of that track that you're seeing, that is all built up too. You know, when you build a rail line, you have to have a certain grade. You can't have railroads going up and down like you have auto roads. So there is massive earth movement that is happening to bring that track up and across the Salmon Falls River. It changed the total geography of the northern area of this village. And when the B&M built their bridge, they spanned over the North Road that connected to Route 256. And if you look at the top two photos of the bridge, you can see that road still in those images. One of them, you have a little carriage on it, and the other one you can see where the road passes under the bridge. The arrival in the early 1850s of what would soon become the Portsmouth, Great Falls, and Conway Railroad that ran from Portland up the Salmon Falls Valley in Maine and on through New Hampshire to North Conway had a more tangible impact on the point. It had a depot on the New Hampshire side of the river, seen behind the horse in this 1860s photo in the bottom corner here. And the rail traveled just north of the road to Quantigan, meeting at the end of Butler Street and continuing to, and creating a stone box culvert at the Salmon Falls Brook, and that's actually a wonderful historic photo of the railroad. And once again, you can see, you know, here's the culvert, and then look at all of this cribbing that is created to get that grade that we need that's even higher for that rail line. Once again, massive change to the landscape of this area. And it's because of this road that that original road had to be abandoned, because if you look at this detail in the center, looking from Salmon Falls to South Berwick, you can see there's a massive drop in grade here. So that road was no longer passable. So when this road was cut in 1852, 1853, that's when what is now Lower Main Street, originally Salmon Street, is created, creating that direct line to South Berwick Village and becoming the heart of this neighborhood. And this image, which is the earliest image that I could find showing sort of that landscape, it shows this this building with a burnt out roof on the Salmon Falls Gas Works. It's early, it's pre-1870. We know that because that building is gone by 1871. So you're looking, you know, at a really nice early map, and what we can see is those first three buildings that are on the left-hand side, those are still there today. That's Butler Hill behind us. And you can see the Free Will Baptist Church before the town clock was added to it as well. Incredible image of the Old Historical Society. So in the 1840s, Salmon Falls Mill sold to Boston investors, and that decade it doubled in size. The local Yankee population was unable to provide the workforce needed for the mills. With the coming of the railroad, which enabled this expansion, it also brought a flux of Irish immigrants to the region. The Irish were arriving in the United States in large numbers to escape the devastation of the Irish potato famine, and were a ready and affordable workforce. In 1853, where's my little? Oh, there we go. Sorry, we're going ahead. Going back. Whoop, and we're going. Sorry. So. In 1853, the company treasurer Amos A. Lawrence wrote, "The high cost of labor must and can be reduced. This belongs to the duty of the agent, and the undersigned is of the opinion that our present agent, Mr. Lawton, is competent to do it. If he cannot, he will resign his place to another." There's a very direct threat. He then describes American girls as less reliable over the past summer, and were especially known to leave their work and go home. The agent later responded to this threat with a letter that the Irish are bound to go to Dover unless the village can allow for a church, which it did not have, and establishment farms. He then warns in 2 more pages of this letter, he warns why the Irish would be problematic to introduce to the village and stresses the need to keep the local girls and the Irish as separate as possible. That same year, Lawrence reports that the company had purchased a large house for $2,900, which will accommodate 100 boarders and will relieve the others which have been crowded. Built by Louis Stiles, and you can see in the first map, which is in the 1830s, it's S-T-I-L-E-S. By 1851, it's S-T-Y-L-E-S. I don't know which the spelling is correct, but Stiles Block is located in what is today the parking lot of St. Mary's Church. And when you see the churchyard below, that's where the post office is today. And you can see the J.W. Wentworth buildings. That's the Wentworth House in its original location. So a year after its purchase, Styles Block was indeed filled with 100 tenants, and the company records report, if the Irish should predominate as to discuss the American operatives, the character of the village must be very much changed for the worse. Every care must be taken to keep them in separate boarding houses and to separate them in the village. The large boarding house, lately purchased, is some distance away from the Irish and will be occupied by the Irish. Unfortunately, the other houses are near to each other and near the mills, and the separation of the hands is not made easy. And here we have Styles Block is visible to the left in this photo, which is circa 1870. St. Mary's was constructed in 1857, but not with the help from the company. 1854 reports for the company state, since writing the above information has been received, the Catholics of Berwick, in connection with those of Salmon Falls, have made a movement to retain a clergyman, and a person is now on his way to Boston to confer with the bishop and make the necessary arrangement. It is desirable they should act independently of the company, especially if they should undertake locating a church building. There is bitter feeling against the Irish on the Berwick side of the river, which showed itself in a riot last year. Any attempt to place a church in that place is known to be encouraged by the company would meet with resistance. On the other hand, the location of a church on the Salmon Falls side will prejudice our own people and might induce some to leave. So what happened was the Irish indeed needed a place to live, and you had all this land that was open on the Berwick side of the river, so the area of Point began developing into a shanty town. And the incident that he mentions relates to a murder that year. In June of 1853, is it wrong to blaspheme in the church? I can say that if I do that, it's prayer, right? Louise is seeking her vengeance on me. And we're back. So, there's my cursor. The incident, okay, so in June of 1853, the Boston Pilot reported that Louis Maxwell, a stable keeper, was murdered and a young man named Cray badly stabbed by two men named Waters and one named Snell. The two former were found secreted in the attic, and Snell was found in the woods. The difficulty originated through an insult offered by Walters and Snell to a young woman one night last week. Okay, one night last week, a mob of about 1,000 persons from Great Falls, Dover, South Berwick, and Salmon Falls, New Hampshire, assembled around the shanties near the spot where murder of Maxwell occurred, and the Irish families there, having moved out of accordance with previous notice sent to them by the mob. Wasn't that nice of them? The buildings were demolished. Other disturbances were anticipated. The paper later reported an anonymous account of the attack from a self-described eyewitness who refuted the claims of the local paper of Irish drunkenness and stated, "Sir, I will now endeavor to give you an idea, though yet a faint one, of the inhuman treatment which the Irish in general of Salmon Falls received from the Bible-reading Yankees and that of the adjoining towns on the night of the 2nd. A mob suddenly appeared in the streets and marched to the houses occupied by the Irish, and without any previous notice immediately commenced a thorough demolition of the buildings, thereby leaving the Irish men, women, and children, widows, and all as they say, were to take refuge in the woods or remain in the streets until morning. The yells and blasphemies of the mob, whilst in the act of tearing down the houses and tossing the broken fragments of the furniture belonging to the Irish into the air, resembled the howlings of demons or the distant roaring of wild beasts. Sam Dixon, the proprietor of one of the grog shops spoken of, was the commander-in-chief of the Bible-reading savages, and when the shanties were all broken up, Sam pointed them to other houses occupied by the Irish, and was seen to fetch them out pails full of brandy several times that they might better able to execute their devilish designs. Not a great day. Now this area in American history is marked with the rise of the American Party and politics, better known and aptly known as the Know-Nothings, because they were required to say, "I know nothing," when questioned about by outsiders on any of their party specifics. It began in the 1840s. It was a nativist movement that was anti-immigrant, in particular, anti-Irish and anti-Catholic. It played upon fears of change and social shifts, and was particularly popular in New England, gaining strength in this area in the 1850s, rising to a brief peak of power in 1856 until their collapse until their collapse later that year. And I mean, this was, like you can see here, in the 1850s, this party was the party. And it was solely to try to stop the expansion of the Irish and Catholics. And this fear of Catholicism is fascinating in the 19th century, and also was coming to a head at this time. Anti-Irish and anti-Catholic sentiment was fueled with the belief that the influx of Irish immigrants to the United States was an intentional invasion to bring the U.S. under the control of the Pope. This 1871 political cartoon by Thomas Nast's wife was not so subtle allegories that were popular with class at the time. So in the distance, you have the Vatican, but it says Tammany Hall, referencing the corrupt Tammany Hall political system in New York City. On the shores, which are being attacked by bishops whose mitre hats look like alligator mouths, are young children that are being tossed down to the embankment by the Tammany Hall operatives and being protected by the one lone Protestant with the Bible tucked into his vest. And in the distance, you can see that there's the American public schools crumbling into dust with the American flag flying upside down to indicate distress. And then further up, you can see Lady Liberty of Columbia being led to the gallows. They really didn't like the Catholics. And as well as the time of the 1850s, it's also an area that was connected with the temperance movement, which saw the consumption of alcohol as the root of all of society's problems, and sought to end its consumption in the United States. In 1851, the Maine law passed, which created a total ban on the manufacture or sale of liquor in the state. This law remained in effect in various forms until it's repealed by the National Prohibition Act of 1934. Liquor was still, though, a problem in South Berwick, and there was strong resistance to the temperance movement in town. Now, residents of Washington and Franklin Street in Salmon Falls on the New Hampshire side of the river, living or owning property that was not under strict deed restrictions set by the company elsewhere in the village, took advantage of Maine's law and the town's position as the first stop in New Hampshire off the Boston and Maine Railroad by establishing bars like George Wentworth's Blue House at 410 Washington Street, or Joseph Susie's at 426 Washington Street, and Fred Karen at 428 Washington Street. And not only did they have bars, but like Susie and Karen also into the liquor distribution business. So the illegal trade, the legal liquor trade in Salmon Falls left behind this wonderful wealth of material culture that includes business cards and photographs and advertisements and bottles and souvenirs like shot glass, and then my favorite, which is this tag that's in the collection of Rob Desmond from Susie's bar, where he's at, I'm out on a hell of a time, and it says, if my wife finds out Tyler was an old stomach problem. I mean, it's just great. And so you could come to New Hampshire, buy your liquor, and then head back up to Maine and have a grand old time at home. However, it doesn't mean that this wasn't happening on the South Berwick side of the river. It was illegal, and therefore we don't have that same material culture to sort of chart who was doing what. However, we do have papers. And articles like these ran in the regional papers from 1850s to the early 20th century, documenting this activity through articles on the numerous raids to stop the sale of drink, including this wonderful one of Kate Sullivan, who was raided several times, escaped and captured in 1891 with her, quote, phenomenal athletic ability by skipping out the back window of her establishment when they came to raid it. In 1889, the Biddeford Saco Journal noted the neighborhood was known to some as Hog Point and others as Happy Valley, and stated it has for years enjoyed the notoriety of being the toughest place in New York County. And I love that these two quotes at the bottom. One might think the scars from Deputy Sheriff Stackpole is covered with is that he had been through a Hog Point raid. A shelf fell in his office and all the contents fell on him. But then also, these are not just Irish. In the 19th century, you have Irish, you have French Canadians, you have Yankees that are all operating these bars in this area. I also love Tim Flynn, who keeps the house at the top of the hill, which looks down into Happy Valley, weighs 200 pounds and is reckoned at that. By 1872, the area is finally on the map. We don't have really good detailed maps of this area until 1872, which also speaks to that lack of development. And in this map, you can totally see that somewhat separated by the Salmon Falls Brook is a bit of a hodgepodge of housing to the north and a more orderly group of housing to the south, and two small factories along the river to the east. And you note the driveway that travels under that railroad tracks along a small mill pond for McIntyre Sash and Wine Factory and Style Soap Factory. That's how high that grade is, that you could bring the road underneath the rail to connect to recently laid out Salmon Street. The division of housing on either side of the river may reflect to the south the growth of South Park Village that is then later consumed by the growth of the point 20 years later. So Hog Point. Anyone want to get, why do you think it's called Hog Point? I would love somebody. Anyone?
Farmer.
I'm sorry?
Hog farmer.
And you're wrong, but that's the answer I was hoping somebody would get. And it is anti-Irish, and we're going to this. So this is what I love. You all heard of Brigadoon, a 1947 musical about a magic Scottish village that appears about one day every 100 years. Here in South Berwick, we have Pigadoon, which is a local urban legend about a fictitious pig farm that comes up anytime anyone asks about why is Hog Point called Hog Point. There's a pig farm. There is no pig farm.
Yes.
Now, usually places named Hog Point or Hogtown, like this image of Hogtown that existed in what's now Midtown New York City during the 1860s, had pigs. A lot of pigs. So many pigs. However, we know that there were no big pig farms at the point. Or really, no more pigs at the point than existed anywhere else in Berwick or South Berwick and Rollinsford in the 18th or 19th centuries. So we turn to our dictionary. So hog. What is a hog? There are a couple things. A hog can be a domestic swine, usually over 120 pounds. It can be a selfish, gluttonous, or filthy person, or, interesting connections here, 19th century slang for a railroad agent. So let's look at a point. A point could be a railroad switch, a projecting, usually tapering piece of land or sharp prominence, like Dover Point, or a particular place or location, like Point of Graves. There are no railroad switches really in Hog Point, so we can really take the whole railroad switch and put it aside. So that means what I really think we have is we have a particular place or location. That's what the point reference is. But the bigger question is what is referenced by the word hog? And while the railroad engine is contended considering the two rail lines that ran through the area, the real point where they converge is in Salmon Falls, which never bore this moniker. It's also important to note that I have never seen the term Hog Point used in conjunction with any reference to trains or the railroad. The first datable appearance of the name in reference to this neighborhood is on August 11, 1859. And there we go. On that day, a fire started at the depot building across the river in Salmon Falls and spread over the river, destroying a dozen buildings. And here's where the article says, at a place known as Hog Point, occupied by Irish families. The article also references the property owners who were not Irish, having the property insured and will be okay, as well as the groggeries rolling up their stock so that the fire wouldn't consume it. Previously, in this talk, we had just discussed the attitudes of the locals to the Irish immigrants that worked at the mills and lived at Hog Point. And now when we think of the Irish, I always think of, the advertisements that would appear in papers with Nina. I'm not talking about Nina now, I'm talking about the No Irish Need Apply. And when discussing prejudice with the Irish, we really have to look at this. It's this deep bias that lasted for much of the 19th century that is much greater than we don't want Irish people working in our establishment. There's a reason for that's not good. So the 19th century was an era where chronology was thought to be a science. This is telling a person's personality and intelligence by the shape and bumps on their heads. And eugenics was used to justify first a slave society and later the repression and discrimination of non-white races. It was also a time where many Americans believed that the Irish were not really white, but a mixed race that, due to their isolation on the island, quote, had never been out-competed by the healthy struggle of life, and thus made way according to the laws of nature for superior races. There was a belief in this time period, the 1850s up through the early 20th century, that the Irish were not white, that the Irish were a subservient race, and in the 19th century, race, and it's still an issue today, but race was critically important in how you were treated and what you were able to access in society. This dehumanization of the Irish in text and political cartoons began in England, but soon carried over to the United States, often depicted as monkeys or thuggish apes. They were also sometimes depicted as pigs. Here, Irish nationalist John Mitchell is depicted as a monkey in 1848, riding on the back of fellow nationalist William Smith O'Brien, who has the body of a pig. Donald Casey's thesis on the subject for Trinity College Dublin is available online and provides a really, if you're interested in this is a whole other talk, but it provides a really good discussion on this topic. And the use of pig images, while not as prevalent as the thuggish ape image, continued throughout the 19th century. And you can see here, the pig that won't pay the rent is a reference to a practice in Ireland of a family to keep a pig as a way to augment their income. And they were often referred to as, quote, the pig who pays the rent. And that association of poor Irish with the pig became another trope. Images of pigs in parlors became popular in the 19th century, playing off the concept that the Irish were somehow a lesser race of dirty. There is also a popular folk song that was recorded by the Smithsonian. You know the song, The Bear Goes Over the Mountain? Well, instead it's, there's a pig in a parlor, there's a pig in a parlor, there's a pig in a parlor, and then the punchline is, and he is Irish too. Yeah. And that association continued into the 20th century with a number of postcards ranging from humorous to sentimental, celebrating pigs in the Irish for Valentine's Day, New Year's, birthdays, Christmas, you name it. It's weird. And it's also, I want to note, like, this is not, the hog point is not a name that exists before the Irish moved into that area. It doesn't appear in deeds. Historian Eric Stackpole commented on this in his reference to the name of the brook running through the neighborhood stating, the northern one of which in later in degenerate days, and he's talking about the brook, called by the unclassical name Hog Point Brook. I'm sorry that I can't restore the Indian name. It is called Salmon Falls Brook in early deeds. Hog Point Brook, Hog Brook. None of this appears in any deeds. It only appears starting in the 1850s. And the name always appears in contexts that are derogatory, like the liquor raids, impertinent, neighborhood baseball teams, team names that are done by kids, or satirical, like this July 4th celebration at Hog Point. This poster for an event that likely occurred and was part of sort of the ancient and horrible parade tradition, started in the 1850s and continued in some communities, still going on today. In fact, pictured here is Summersworth Ancient and Horribles Parade from 1896. And if you want to learn more about this, is another whole topic. Jane Islander's book, The Best Ever, covers the history of these parades and these events very well. And while the names in events are somewhat tongue-in-cheek, this is likely an event that happened. I mean, if you read some of this, you know, you have the Witch Chuck, Howling Cavalry, you have the Babylon Band, the Queen's Own 900 Strong, you have a regatta on McIntyre's Point with Chinese junks. And they probably had these events. And we know, for example, picture to the right is McIntyre's Pond, where that regatta probably happened. That's another stereogroup from the 1860s. And we also know there was a tradition of lighting off cannon at Salmon Falls in the 1850s. From this article documenting a disastrous July 4th, and why boys with cannon are not a great combination. And if you disagree with me and are still not convinced that Hog Point could be a local slang term for an Irish neighborhood in town, I want to point out that it is not the only Irish associated site in the area in a derogatory sobriquet. After it was purchased by the Salmon Falls Manufacturing Company in the 1850s, Styles Block became known locally as the Irish Tavern because Irish people drink, of course, playing on that track. And what's interesting is when the Catholic Church published its first history in 1927, it talked about the first masses happening in, quote unquote, the Irish Tavern. Now, where does Happy Valley come in? So we have this community, it has this name, it has this illegal drunken trade going on, and we have also this temperance movement. And there was temperance societies both in South Berwick and in Rollinsford. In the 1870s in Dover, there was this group called the Reform Club, and they decided they were a huge temperance organization. It was multi-denominational, and they decided that they were going to seed reform clubs throughout the area. There was one in Somerset, one in Portsmouth, one everywhere. I mean, they just spread like everywhere. They actually had a convention in Dover where you had 700 Reform Club members marching around town holding torches in their hands. So by the 1870s, by 1876, the name Happy Valley was born. And want to read this because it's just a great little article. The meeting of the Reform Club Monday evening was unusually animating and interesting. New-Wichita, pictured here, was crowded to its utmost capacity, showing that the interest of the people in this most important movement has not yet abated. Short speeches were made by members of the club and visitors interspersed with tempered songs by the Salmon Falls Glee Club and music by the Salmon Falls Band. The members of the Glee Club have gained particular credit in the composition of the rendering of a song entitled The Happy Valley. It refers to that locality between the two villages, heretofore designated by a name once suggestive of filth and gluttony, but which hereafter will be known as the Happy Valley by a resolution passed by the assemblage after the singing. The club meets every Monday. So, 1876, this group of people decide we're going to call it Happy Valley, and the name sticks. And if you ever want any proof that whatever entity runs our universe has a sardonic sense of humor, then look no further to South Berwick, where the name celebrated by Temperance Club only survives as a beer and wine garden today. Now, all this time, Happy Valley Hog Point was mostly in Berwick, Maine. But as early as the 1870s, residents in South Berwick began to craft petitions to annex the neighborhood into South Berwick. I've not found documentation as to why, but my hypothesis is that the neighborhood distance from Berwick's town center made policing and controlling of illicit activities difficult, and it must have been an incredible nuisance and an expense for South Berwick, who was right next door. The line was basically drawn along the northern boundary, basically along the northern track of the Spencerville Mid Boston Maine track, and it wasn't a happy breakoff from Berwick. There was an article where another portion of South Berwick 20 years later was being considered to go to South Berwick from Berwick, and the Berwick selectmen were complaining about how much they lost in taxes when this neighborhood broke off in the 1880s. Now, while Quebec migration to New England started in the 1840s, it began to expand tremendously after the Civil War of the 1830s. And starting in the 1870s, there was a huge influx of Quebecois to Salmon Falls in South Berwick. And I love this, you know, the Grand Seigneur, or the Great Hemorrhage, commonly known as the Great Hemorrhage. The Quebec explorer spread into Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, Vermont, where textile manufacturers and other industries were hiring. By 1830, as the Great Depression ended, exile, some 900,000 French Canadians had immigrated to the United States, most of them in New England. I mean, that is a massive amount of people coming within a fairly short period of time. And it also affected this area. The 1880s also saw a tremendous change. So up until 1884, New Hampshire was part of the Diocese of Maine. So St. Mary's in Rollinsford was actually the Catholic church for the Catholics on both sides of the river. In 1884, the Diocese of Manchester is created, and St. Mary's is on that side of the river. For 2 years, the Catholics still attend that church, but then in 1886, St. Michael's, which is now the town library, is built. And this is the one boundary that for the Catholics, both Irish and French, stuck. They may flip-flop back and forth on that border, but when you lived on the Rollinsford side of the river, you went to St. Mary's. When you lived on the South Berwick side of the river, you went to St. Michael's. And I think this is why, if you look at larger communities like Dover or Somersworth or Rochester, there's always the Irish church and then the French church. This didn't happen here. I think it would have. If the Diocese of Manchester had never been created, I think that there would have been a splintering and there would have been a French-Canadian church that would have been created at some point. There would have been two Catholic churches. But because the diocese created that line and made that partition, both St. Michael's and St. Mary's had to cater both to French Canadians and to Irish. And I'm not going to talk a lot about the church or the schools because they're out of the point and that's a whole other talk, but I do encourage you that the exhibit at the Counting House is well worth going to see. Now, the French Canadians worked in those, but they also did other things. They did the work that nobody else wanted to do. And I love this letter from J.S.F. Wadley, who lived in South Berwick on a farm, writing to a friend in Pottersville, New Hampshire in 1882. I have been very busy since I wrote you last, so we had a good deal of farm work to do in the fall and during the winter, has been lumbering and hauling wood. I had 150 cords cut this winter and employed Frenchmen to cut it. And this vicinity, most of the Yankees feel themselves above chopping the wood, are just too lazy to do it. Therefore, we hire French, and I love this, Canadians, French who come out of our manufacturing villages to shop. And they would have done jobs. They actually would have also worked in lumber mills when the mills slowed down. And this also created some of the stress that existed between the French and the Irish. When the Irish came here, they couldn't go home. If the mill shut down, they were here. If the mill shut down, the French Canadians could hop on a train and go visit their relatives back home. And then when the mill started up again, come back down. Women also took in odd jobs. French Canadian, I bet the Irish did too. I love this picture of this, I think it's the Barney block over in the Point, no longer standing. Look at all that laundry. It would not have been unusual for women to take in laundry from unmarried men to add to their family. And the French Canadians created their own culture, and separate from other immigrant groups, really resisted the whole idea of assimilating. And we had talks previously in this lecture series on those Quebecois, I won't go into that in detail. But they created social opportunities and social organizations like this play on the Rollinsford Town Hall stage, or this image of the Canada-American Society in Salmon Falls. But they also faced prejudice, including the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s in this area that was incredibly anti-Catholic and very anti-French. Here you see the Ku Klux Klan marching on their way to burn a cross on the property that became St. Raphael's Church. And then also on Lindsay Road, still standing today, was the Klan headquarters for York. But also, there are also prejudices on the other side as well. I remember I was doing an interview once with a woman named Lucinda St. Lawrence who grew up in Salmon Falls. And it was a time in the 1990s when this group of women used to meet, they called themselves the Salmon Falls Beauties. And it was people who lived in Salmon Falls when Salmon Falls was still called Salmon Falls. And she's like, oh, I'm going to go. She goes, it's funny, Dorothy Green comes to this, and when we were children, she never had anything to do with us. 2 days later, I happened to be in Dorothy Green's house, and I asked her if she was going to the Salmon Falls Beauties, and she's like, yeah, so I don't know. Most of my friends aren't there anymore, and well, it's most of the French girls, and when we were kids, they never had anything to do with us. That prejudice cuts both ways, and discrimination cuts both ways. And we also see that there's some racism with the French Canadians, too. Here's this lovely minstrel show on the stage of St. Michael's School, and 6 girls in blackface. With the flux of Franco-Americans into this region, it's when we see the Point really develop in the 20th century and the neighborhood that we know today. More housing comes in. The loss of the factories in this area, the sash and blind factory go, the soap factory's gone. And the development we really see starting to develop of a commercial space. But what I also love is if you look along those boxes, that northern end of town, you still see this hodgepodge of buildings that look like they've almost grown organically, that really relate to that early shantytown history. By 1927, the area reached its peak with clothing stores and confectioners, tenements, apartments, and single-family homes, cobblers and barbers, and an entertainment complex called the Palace. It also had Roberge's Bakery and the Doobie grocery store that would follow a national trend to grow to be regional distributors of their goods, expanding the influence of this neighborhood. Yet with all these changes, the north of the town still had that jumble of buildings that spoke to those old shanty days, and by the 1920s, the Franco-American, Irish, and Yankees, who lived in this mix of vernacular and high-style architecture, had finally made the Point, and in spite of what we call it, Hog Point, Happy Valley, they made it home. Questions? I accept it.
Peter, you won't believe me, but I did not look this up beforehand just to stump you. But the brook that runs down under that wonderful stone box trust, not trust, but help me out here. Anyway,
Box color.
has borne a number of names. Who was Driscoll? And what I found, and I literally stumbled over it, is before Driscoll it was Smith's Brook.
Yes.
Who was Smith? Who was Driscoll?
I believe they own property upriver. I know Driscoll did. I don't know Smith, but the earliest name for that brook up until the 1850s and through the 19th century was Salmon Falls Brook.
As you know, if you look at a map at a particular frame of time, the name of a pond, the name of a brook will have different.
But this one is steadily, every map that we have that shows that brook is Salmon Falls Brook until the end of the 19th century.
Okay, I've got a topo map that shows it as Driscoll's.
Right, till the end of the 19th century.
Yeah,
Your topo map would be 20th century.
yeah, absolutely, yeah. My other question is this, this seems like awfully early to me to be a temperance event, but the deck truss bridge, which was then timber, and of course now it's iron and steel, was arson. I think it was around 1855, and surprisingly it had nothing to do with religion. It seems to have been arson by a guy who was protesting that he couldn't get booze.
It actually, that's a misnomer. It burned in 1849, but the fire actually started with the grist mill that stood underneath that bridge.
Uh-huh. So why were there charges?
There were several arsons that occurred in that area, and there was the assumption that that was an arson, but if you find, there are newspaper accounts when that bridge burned, and the fire started in the grist mill below,
So it was 1849.
1849.
Well, at least I was wrong.
Yes,
Right.
in the right general area.
So I know you said it was another, a whole other program, so I'll get back to you on that, but,
The danger of saying such things.
I know, but I really appreciate it. But I'm curious about why the church and the schools aren't in the plan.
Well, I think it's in part that there's no land. But, you know, in the 1880s, it's where you're gonna find available land. And so, you know, when the church was built, Young Street is a very new street.
Okay.
And so there were lots to be had. When the original, supposedly according to Mr. Robert Jr., the original St. Rose's School was held in the hall or opera house that you can see on the top of the street here. This is looking down into Happy Valley.
Okay.
Then the nuns were able to purchase Frost Tavern, which had land in the back, and that's when they built that, and then they built St. Michael's School next door, and create a little Catholic education complex there. Yes?
That one picture you had of the trolley, how wide of a trolley's area did that cover?
That connected through, it was part of the Atlantic Trolley line, which eventually went up to the Quebec ports. It went down to Portsmouth, Dover, Rochester, never hit Somersworth, I take that, well, it did hit Somersworth where the trolley drivers were. That line actually this was never meant to be the terminus. The trolley, it's funny, the trolley in this area, we have such a romanticized love of it, but it was a flash in the pan historically. And this trolley line was meant to continue on to Somersworth, and they just never got around to it, and the trolley line folded. But it was part of a large regional network.
Was that also part of that turntable that's down there?
Yes,
That was a turntable, was a trolley?
was a trolley. Yeah.
Wait a minute, that turntable.
Oh, wait, no, that's I'm sorry.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm thinking of the trolley barn.
Yeah, the turntable was a
Well,
railroad turntable.
yeah, that was the Great Falls Conway.
Exactly.
Railroad of many names, but Portsmouth, Great Falls, and Conway.
Right. Which never really went down to Portsmouth, but, you know, Moose County.
Yeah.
House.
Anyone else? Yes.
The Palace Theater that was down there,
Yes.
pretty controversial place from what I understand over the years.
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, they did boxing, but it never really was, compared to what previously happened at the point, it was not really that kind of a notorious place. And they did family programming, they had roller skating. It was actually, a fairly wholesome place. Multiple entertainment movies until it burned down.
Where was it?
Right, so if you go down where the Happy Valley Wine Bar is, Wine and Beer Garden, on the other side of the road. Just another note, I didn't add this, but when you go to the Happy Valley Wine and Beer Garden and they're sitting at those picnic tables, you're sitting in the foundation of a large tenement house that used to be called the Children's Factory, because there were so many immigrants with so many kids, that's what the locals called it.
When I was a kid, you would walk by and you walk into the side.
Peter, speaking of children, I understand that in the early days, which I guess would be the really, really early days, that people that lived on one side of the river on the other, and I'm not sure which direction it went, the kids just went across the river to school. Was there some truth to that?
That I don't know, because you have, Salmon Falls had its own school. And We know that later on, in Rollinsford at least, if you wanted to get a high school education, you either went to Dover or you went to Berwick Academy. But, as for children just hopping over the river, New England towns being New England towns, I don't think any Yankee would want to be educating anybody else's children and paying the taxes to do that.
You mentioned that originally that was part of the town of Berwick.
Right.
Where about would the border have run today, by today's president?
We go back to the 1870s map. Keep going back. Sorry. Almost there. Pigs. Here we go. If you look, it's hard to see, but you can see there's a dotted line. Yep. This dotted line right here. So right about where Butler Street is. This is Butler Street right here. And you can see this dotted line that comes up and goes down. And that's everything on this side of the river is Berwick. And everything on this line is Berwick, and everything on this side of the line is South Berwick. So South Berwick Village was literally right on the edge of town.
Trolley line also going to the Moon Pond Park?
Yes, that was where that's where the cars were, the car bands were.
Where the trolley line?
Yes.
Isn't that the guy who's drinking, who's doing that?
Yes, it is.
All right, well, we have some great refreshments there, and thank you very much, and would you thank our